Hello everyone, good evening or good day whenever you are watching this. My name is Mary McAuliffe and I'm a historian and lecturer in gender studies at UCD. And today I want to talk to you about a subject I have been doing research on for the last couple of years on the revolutionary period. I have been interested in the experiences of women for a very long time during this period and have been doing work on that. But particularly I'm at the present working on gendered violence between 1919 and 1923. And so this evening I want to talk to you about Cumann, militancy and gendered violence 1919 to 1921. And if you bear with me for a moment, I'm going to put up the PowerPoint that I'm going to use this evening. The title of my talk is I Had a Mouthful of Steel, Cumann and Militancy and Gendered Violence 1919 to 1921. And this quotation comes from a title in the Mary Comerford papers, which are held at the UCD archives. Comerford herself was a well-known Republican and journalist. Born in Wicklow in 1893, she had spent some time in England where she trained as a secretary, and where she developed an awareness of the political situation in Ireland. And like many women of the diaspora, she came back fully radicalised to Ireland. She credits seeing an Abbey Theatre performance of Kathleen Clark by W.B. Yeats in London as part of her political awakening. And on her return to Ireland, she came to live and work in Gorey in County Wexford in the middle of the first decade of the 20th century. Although she does not become a militant nationalist until a little bit later on, she begins first, as many of these women do, through feminism, through cultural nationalism, and through trade union activism. They don't become militants from the very beginning. She did witness the 1916 rising in Dublin. She was actually visiting relatives there. She herself was not a participant, but it did have a profound and radicalising effect on her political beliefs. And she subsequently joined her local Gorey, County Wexford branch of Sinn Féin in 1916 and Cumann in 1917 following year. In 1918, she moved to Dublin, where she worked for Cumann, and she was also employed as a secretary to the historian and nationalist Alice Staffords Green, in whose home she met many leading nationalists. So during the 1918 election, she campaigned for Sinn Féin, and after the War of Independence broke out, she travelled the country organising for Cumann branches, carrying dispatches for the IRA 4th Northern Division, and reporting for the White Cross on Black and Tans atrocities, and this is the part of her work I want to look at. She and Staffords Green did subsequently split on the treaty, as many of these Cumann women did. Comerford was vehemently anti-treaty, and Staffords Green was pro-treaty, and in fact becomes one of the founder members of Cumann na Saoirse, the pro-treaty women's organisation, many of whom members had previously been in Cumann, but left because of the treaty. So the treaty splits not only brother and brother, but also sister and sister during this time. During the bombardment of the Four Courts in 1922, she carried dispatches between the IRA, the anti-treaty forces in the Four Courts and the IRA's Dublin Brigade, and later acted as a courier for Republican units in various parts of the country. So she goes from a feminist, somebody who was working with United Irish Women, somebody who was involved in women's activism, to a militant Republican and dedicated anti-treatyite by 1922. Her involvement in an unsuccessful attempt to kidnap Cosgrave in January 1923 resulted in her arrest and imprisonment in Mountjoy jail. In prison with other Cumann women, she staged protests over overcrowding, which resulted in her removing to the criminal section of the prison and a sentence of 3 months hard labour. In response, like many of the other women, she went on hunger strike. During her imprisonment, she was shot in the leg by a Free State soldier because she was waving to fellow prisoners, after which she was transferred to the North Dublin Union, from which she escaped on the 9th of May, 1923. Following her rearrest on the 1st of June, she again resorted to the tactic of the hunger strike, and after 3 weeks, she was released from Kilmainham jail on a stretcher. She remained involved in Cumann after this, She does remain a Republican all of her life. Although she lived outside Dublin, she was often isolated from her Republican comrades. She continued to make a living from writing and journalism, although her only published work, The First Dáil, which concerns the establishment and workings of the First Dáil was published early on, and that's the only published work. She does have a diary or a I suppose, a work that describes her experiences from the beginning of her radicalization through the War of Independence and Civil War in her papers in UCD, but it remains unpublished. It's called The Dangerous Ground and was written in the 1950s of her life and activism. And it is from this memoir that I draw the above quote, which occurred in March 1921. So Staffords Green house on Stephen's Green, and this is Margaret Comerford here on the right as you are looking at it, was in 19 Stephen's Green and was a meeting place for leading nationalists throughout the War of Independence and frequently raided by British soldiers, sometimes twice in a single evening, and this was not unusual. From that house, Staffords Green and Comerford organised and distributed Republican propaganda once the War of Independence broke out, and they, according to Comerford's unpublished memoirs, also hid arms. She describes one black and tan raid during which she had to hide ammunition given to her the previous day by Roger Casement's brother, Tom. In March 1921, shortly after the murder of the Lord Mayor of Limerick, Michael O'Callaghan, by the black and tans in his home in front of his wife, Kathleen O'Callaghan, later herself a TD and anti-treatyite like Comerford, number 90 St. Stephen's Green was raided. The description of the raid reads as follows, and you can see that there on the screen. Shortly afterwards, and here she's referring to the murder of O'Callaghan, there was another raid, this time by uniformed auxiliaries. Once again, I opened the door. I was pushed back against the wall. He, the auxiliary, forced his revolver into my mouth. He was a man we had come to know as Taylor's nephew because of what happened at our next meeting. Meanwhile, my mouth was full of steel. We know you. Your mother kept a school in Wexford. You are the bad one in the family, he said. After those first few minutes, this turned into an ordinary raid by men searching for papers. So in many ways, this is a very ordinary account of what was a normal raid on the home of women suspected, rightfully in this case, by the Crown Forces of being very central to Republican activity during the War of Independence. However, those minutes when the raid turned more sinister and violent, when Comerford was backed up against a wall with a fully loaded revolver forced into her mouth, are a stark reminder that the targeted violence against political and militant women, many of whom bore the brunt of reprisals against Republicans, as unlike men, they were not able to go on the run, happened quite regularly. Indeed, to return to the incident which Comerford mentions, which helps us date this incident in number 90, the killing of Michael O'Callaghan, the experience of his wife during that killing, while rarely alluded to in the narratives of the murder, was similar to the experience of Comerford and the others. Indeed, the raid in which her husband was killed was not the first, nor indeed the last that Kate O'Callaghan would endure in Limerick. This raid happened soon after the funeral of Terence McSweeney, the Lord Mayor of Cork, who had died on hunger strike. And McCurtain, the Lord Mayor of Limerick, had attended, or excuse me, Michael O'Callaghan, the Lord Mayor of Limerick, had attended that funeral. In late October 1920, late in the evening, and these raids often happen late in the evening, she heard frantic knocking on the door. When she asked who was there, she got the answer, police. She opened the door, and as she wrote, as you see here, in rushed a body of policemen armed with rifles and revolvers. They shouted as they rushed past me in the hall, up and down the stairs. Who lives here? Hold the doors. I noticed that they were very red in the face and excited. Their clothes were dusty and untidy, and some of the men were drunk, and often we find reports that the auxiliaries and the black and tans were drunk during these raids. She was terrified that the men would hurt or kill her husband. She described the violence and chaos of the raids. All the men rushed about, shouting and pulling things out, overturning vases, jeering at the long agony of Terence McSweeney, threatening to put a speedy end to my husband's propaganda, yelling that there was no God. God was dead, asking me how I would like my house to go up, saying that they would soon know more about the murder. I had to accompany one man who went off on his own initiative to search the bedrooms, though all the time I was afraid of my husband's safety downstairs. This constable found a military whistle and the mourning armlet which my husband had worn at the funerals of the Lord Mayor McCurtain and the Lord Mayor McSweeney. So I had to go downstairs with a rifle at my back. And you can imagine the terror and trauma, not only for her own safety, but recognizing that her husband was in real danger. She and her husband survived this particular raid, but his life was constantly under threat. The murder raid, which came soon after, as she described it in her Bureau of Military History witness statement, came in March 1921. When she realized that these men had come with more serious intent, she actually tackled them to try and save her husband. She wrote, "I caught at their hands as they tried to get me out of the way. There was a struggle for a second. The man on my right hand, the man with the clear glasses and the blue eyes, freed his right arm and fired over my shoulder. But as the man who had shot Michael was passing us to go out, I flew at him. I had the strength of a maniac. We three fought together in the hall while I screamed all the time. I knocked them twice as our feet slipped on the polished floors. My shoes flew off. I tore at their faces and their heads instinctively. They never said a word, but beat me with their hands on the head, shoulders, and arms. We fell against the umbrella stand, and at last, with an effort, they threw me off, and I fell heavily on my hip on the floor." She noted that she would never forget the agony that she suffered as I lay there screaming and helpless as I watched them running down the grass in the shaft of light from the hall door. These descriptions from Comerford and O'Callaghan of raids on the homes of senior and well-known political activists demonstrate the dangers faced by the leadership of the political Republican movement and by senior members of the IRA, men, as well as the known Cumann women. So the Cumann women were as in danger of raids as everybody else. The evidence of constant raids and terror experienced by political and militant and civilian women has become a major issue for the Crown Forces and the British government by this time. During 1919 to 1922, what was essentially a guerrilla war served to blur the distinction between soldier and civilian, between enemy and friend, between where the conditions of war did and did not prevail. The conditions caused the Crown Forces to, as D.M. Leeson writes, to behave in ways that violated their pre-existing moral and ethical standards, and to fight terror, as they saw it, with terror. While the IRA active service units were on the run, it was up to the women militant Republican organisation, Cumann, to provide the support for them. Most of these activities they conducted from their own homes. So for Cumann women, their homes were, most often, their battleground. The home from Cumann becomes then not a safe space, but a battleground, a space of gendered, and I will argue, sexualized violation and terror. This violation of the intimate, feminine, domestic space reflects, as Louise Ryan notes, the intensely political work that was going on inside many Irish homes in this period. The traditional separate spaces of masculine and feminine had collapsed. War was now everywhere. It was a war that, as Justin Dolan Stover writes, intimate, where the British security forces and the IRA routinely violated private spaces. As Stover also suggests, the acknowledgement of women who bore the brunt of raids and interrogations suggests that some of the most vital contributions to the independence movement took place away from the ambush site. And a lot of our history of the revolutionary movement concentrated on the ambushes, the military history, who killed whom, assassinations, political discussions. But what I'm looking at here is a more intimate history, what the women were doing, but also what they were experiencing. It is often acknowledged by IRA men that women had it hard in their homes. As Michael Hines, a member of the Galway IRA, said, women had it difficult as they had to remain in their homes and there, along with their parents, meet the midnight raiders who come to threaten and bully and burn them out. Even in the most ordinary domestic and familial and communal activities, doing the shopping, going to school with the children, or to mass, there was a threat of constant violence. In evidence given by an RIC member, John McNamara, to the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland, he described an attack by the Crown Forces on women and children coming from evening mass in Ballylongford in County Kerry. He said, "The two black and tans from the barracks went to the church in the village at about 7 in the evening, with 200 or 300 residents were at evening devotion. They stationed themselves at the gate of the church with batons and beat the people as they came through the gate. There were many women and children beaten upon that night. The two black and tans who perpetrated this outrage boasted about it at the barracks, but no official investigation was ever made, and they were not reprimanded by their superior officers." So there was a tacit acceptance in many areas and in many cases of this violence that was perpetrated on civilians, particularly women and children. As Ernie O'Malley wrote about the black and tan reprisals on family homes and on women, "There was a silence for a time as we watched, helpless, feeling cowardly and miserable. Many other IRA men expressed similar despondency. Eamon O'Dwyer, in his witness history statement, Eamon was Assistant Brigade Quartermaster of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade, talked about the time he got a telegram to say, which read simply, 'Kilshannan burnt down last night,' and this was his family home. And the story of the burning was told to him. Said, 'My mother, Miss Hope, my sister and her 2 children were clustered together for mutual solace in the bedroom, when about midnight they heard the trampling of men as they rushed in the avenue from the road. A moment later, the door was battered down and there was a shout, women and children out. 2 masked men were in the crowd of about a dozen soldiers, and they shouted, "Where's Dwyer, the murderer?" My sister faced them bravely and replied, "My brother is no murderer, but a gallant Irishman." Then those 2 threw hand grenades into my room, and after their explosion rushed upstairs with drawn revolvers. The women and children were brought out onto the roadside and kept prisoner under guard, while the remainder of the gang looted, wrecked, and finally burnt the place. Then the hapless prisoners were let go, and they went for refuge to O'Brien's house. They had nothing left to wear except what they stood up in. The propaganda effect of reporting on these raids was very evident. This war on women, as it was termed, was substantial, had substantial propaganda impact. As early as March 1920, Erskine Childers was describing in articles in the Daily Mail for a horrified English public the awful effects of these raids or home invasions had on occupants, especially the women. Series of articles published between March and May 1920 and reproduced in a pamphlet entitled Military Rule in Ireland outlined the effects on homes. "A raid," he wrote, "begins with a thunder of knocks, no time to dress, even for a woman alone, or the door will crash in. On opening, in charge the soldiers, literally charged, with fixed bayonets and in full war kit. In many instances, even the women occupants have been locked up under guard while their own property is ransacked. Is it any wonder that gross abuses occur? Looting, wanton destruction, and brutal severity to women." Through his articles, he outlined the raids on homes and on women, telling personal stories of horror and terror, which of course the impact of that on the reading public in England and further afield was quite telling. And it made the War of Independence and continued military occupation in Ireland quite unpopular. He talked about a raid on the house of Una Brennan, wife of Robert Brennan, which was entitled A Young Mother's Ordeal. Mrs. Brennan was roused by the knocking on her door, and running down in her nightdress, hears a voice shouting, "Damn you, open the door, we'll smash it in." One soldier is drunk and using foul language, and in spite of her passionate supplication to be allowed to her children, she is kept apart under guard while the rooms are searched, and the search is conducted with a roughness worthy of the veritable Huns. Robert Brennan was actually not in the house. He was hiding in a house nearby when one of the raids occurred and felt keenly his inability as a marked man to do anything to help his family. On seeing his wife after the raid, he was shocked at her condition. He said, "I'd never seen her so near a break. She'd been crying. They'd kept her downstairs all night, away from the children, and they'd grilled her and our eldest child, Emer, age 9, for hours on my activities and whereabouts. The 2 younger children, Maeve and Deirdre, were hysterical, which was not to be wondered at. This had all the typical patterns of terror raids on homes, conducted late at night, the women alone or isolated once the raid begins, the drunkenness of the soldiers, the foul language, the abrasive and rough treatment. Childers cleverly references the Huns, the German invaders in Belgium who terrorized and mistreated the women of that country, or Little Belgium as it was called. These propaganda tropes to encourage recruitment in the British Army when the war broke out in 1914 to come and free the women of Little Belgium. Propaganda at that time concentrated on how the Germans mistreated civilians in Belgium, most specifically how the Hun mistreated and visited terror and outrage, including rape, on the women of Belgium. Here Childers presents propaganda evidence that the British soldiers were similarly mistreating Irish women. So here it's being used very effectively for propaganda effect. And it is true that the militant women were also receiving the brunt of reprisals from late 1920 onwards, in large part because of the realization on the part of the Crown forces of their effectiveness as an integral part of the guerrilla war effort. As Lil Collin wrote in her book Cumann and the Women of Ireland, published in 1969, it was late 1920, early 1921 when the British authorities began to recognize the importance of Cumann women to the Cumann effort, to the war effort, excuse me. Then, at that time, she wrote, attention was focused on the women very much at this time by the authorities. They were in receipt of information from their intelligence division, owned to raids and captures of document, and they realized fully that women were playing a major part in the campaign. The going was tough on the female sex. They were unable to go on the run, so were constantly subjected to having their homes raided and precious possessions destroyed. To intensify the reign of terror, swoops were made at night, entries were forced into their homes, the women's hair was cut off in brutal fashion, as well as suffering other indignities and insults. With the opening up of so many new sources and revisiting existing material, we can now attempt to locate the extent of gendered and sexualized violence and place it within the historical narrative of this period. The records are revealing a clearer, more complicated narrative of targeted gendered and sexualized violence against militant women and girls. Revisiting the use of language, the archives, and other sources aims at rebalancing the idea that gendered and sexualized violence was almost absent from the Irish Revolutionary War, and to expand our ever more nuanced understandings of the experience of women and girls during this period. I wish to concentrate on the aspects of violence against women in this period for the rest of my talk with you here. Not only were the associates, wives, mothers, sisters, daughters of revolutionary men targeted during the period, but as Conlon notes, women, particularly militant women themselves, became a target of the Crown forces. This, of course, wasn't the only type of gendered violence in this period, nor the only reason women were targeted. And these other types of violence visited on both the Crown forces, by the Crown forces, and the IRA forms part of my broader research project, which will also look at gender and sexual violence in the Civil War. Here, however, I want to look at specifically at the violence experienced by militant women, the Cumann women, the motives behind it, and the type of violence and how the women recorded that violence themselves. I also want to speak to the possible reason why the violence experienced by militant women was marginalized in the narratives up to now, and how traumatic legacies for those women targeted is only now becoming clear as we do more research. While the sources I'm using include revisiting existing archives, rereading memoirs, contemporary newspapers from the time, one of the richest news sources, of course, is the military services pensions files. Excuse me, I'll turn this off. Hold on a minute. This is the trouble with recording. Now we're back online again. So as I was saying, using different types of sources, we can look at the experience of women. The military service pension files and material that forms the basis of the material I present here to you this evening. Attacks on women on homes affected women militants more than men, and many of Cumann women who later applied for military pensions detail raids and burnings of their homes. The interim report from the American Commission on Condition in Ireland also details some of the violence visited on women during raids on their homes. Women had the privacy of their bedrooms invaded in the dead of night and their hair roughly cut off. Such was the terror of the population that it reported, the Commission, in some places, those who were not on the run and the infirm and the aged, the women and children would appear to feel safer in the fields than out in their own homes. In their military service pension application, we have first-hand accounts of the violence visited on women because of their work. Descriptions in sources like these pension files, the Bureau of Military History, and other archival materials details the escalation and intensity of violence perpetrated on women in their homes. Here's one that I have here. Julia Duffy of Ballinallee, Cumann, County Longford, records that her house was raided several times by the Black and Tans, and on one occasion they brought her outside and beat her about the head mostly. They broke 9 teeth, and she had to get her teeth extracted 3 days later, and there you can see she's talking about that herself. Later in December 1920, after another raid, she and her mother and her sister were burnt out. She was surprised, she's unsurprised, she said to herself, that the Crown forces were not so silly not to know one so prominent as herself. And they would have known also that her brother was adjutant of the local IRA. Another woman, Bridget ODonnell, in Ballylanders in County Limerick, whose house was a known safe house used by the IRA as a base of attack on Ballylanders RIC in the summer of 1920, she kept men in the house and had an arms dump out the back, very common for Cumann women to both be keeping a safe house but also an arms dump. And we know that Bridget ODonnell also took the arms and ammunition to many ambushes. So it was no surprise that after the attack on Kilmallock Barracks, in which she was involved as a scout, that her home was bombed by the Black and Tans at about 2:30 a.m. in the morning. All the shop windows and the goods in the windows were shattered, and 2 weeks later they came back to finish the job and burnt the house down. The incident did not prevent O'Donnell from continuing her work for the IRA and in Cumann, and she lived with her father Humphreys in Knocklong for the following 2 years and continued transporting arms, helping the men on the run, helping with coordination and scouting for ambushes. Similarly, Margaret Brennan of the Meleak branch in Limerick, whose activities brought her to the attention of the authorities, and in October 1920, her comfortable house, which was being subjected to raids several times a week by the Crown forces, was just destroyed by fire, while she and her mother were brutally hustled out on the roadside in night attire and were compelled to seek shelter from neighbours. She said she was compelled to stand the mental torture of seeing her delicate mother disturbed by brutal raids in her home before it was burnt. Even if their homes were not burnt, the attacks served to terrorise women. In Clare, in Innis, Cumann woman Catherine Collins spoke of how when her home was raided, she suffered cruel. I had to leave the house, and the lodgers that were staying with me, they also had to leave the house. In Castleisland, County Kerry, Ellen McGillicuddy, a member of the local Cumann, who had kept rifles, arms and ammunition for the local IRA, had her place, her home and her pub, which had been frequently targeted by the Crown forces, burnt out in May 1921. In another pension statement, Cumann woman Mary O'Neill of Mid-Clare Brigade talked about how hard days followed for her family and herself. Her brother Patrick Lahan was killed at the Renine ambush in September 1920, and on the same evening, British Crown forces came to the door of the house. They shot her father dead at his own door, robbed and plundered the house, and her young, helpless family escaped only by a hair's breadth. Her mother was later a physical and mental wreck after the house had been looted and burnt. This did not stop O'Neill, as noted in the reference. The family took up abode in another house on the farm, and Mrs. O'Neill was as determined as ever in her help to the active service unit. Christina Hearn of the Middleton branch of Cumann had her home burnt out in January 1921 and had to go and live with a neighbour until outbuildings could be converted into a living space. Late in May 1921, the Crown Forces raided the new domestic space, found her brother Michael there and shot him dead in front of her. A raid on the house of Dr. Kathleen Lynn in Dublin, described in the newspaper report on March 1st, 1920, mentioned the half company of soldiers with glittering bayonets and a dozen policemen who surrounded the house. In February 1921, the home of Cumann member Annie Murphy in Kilmichael, County Wexford, was burnt out, and on the occasion of the burning, her mother was dragged out. They, the Black and Tans, left about 9 grenades around the house, and after they left, she had to pick them up and put them in a bucket. The accounts by these women follow similar patterns. Kathleen Clark and Kathleen McDonnell, both activists in Cumann and well known like Dr. Lynn to the Crown Forces, describe houses occupied by women and children raided at night by armed men. The terror of the situation underlined by the fact that the men were rude, insulting, threatening and undisciplined. Clark described a terrifying raid by Crown Forces on her mother's home in Limerick on the occasion that she was visiting that city. The raid was conducted by 7 men, all drunk, and one never knew what drunken men could do. And again, there was always that threat that sexual violence could happen. However, these incidences, as reported by the women of Cumann, came as no real shock to them. They were working for a cause, and the dangers of that work included coming to the attention of the Crown Forces. Sorry, this is the report by Kathleen Clark in Limerick. And they were coming to the attention of the Crown Forces, as I mentioned. In most cases, the women stoically continued their work for the Republican cause until the truce, and many continued on into the Civil War. While some women later wrote of the raids on their homes had left them nervous wrecks, oftentimes they sought to deflect the trauma of their experiences onto their female relatives, speaking of their mothers or sisters who were left as nervous wrecks while they themselves continued to do their work for Ireland. Their seeming stoicism and their emotional and psychological recovery from violence is in stark contrast to the experiences of women not associated with Cumann or actively involved in the war. Again, you can also see the description of a raid on the Daly household in which one of Kathleen Clark's sisters had her hair cut off. And also she was badly injured on the hand and would have bled to death as she was bleeding quite heavily had not one of her sisters had some first aid training and was able to stitch up the wound. The Daly household was raided many times a week, mainly by drunken RIC and auxiliaries and Black and Tans. So, despite the work, however, of these militant women during the war, most mainstream histories construct the role of women in more traditional ways. Historians who mention women's involvement often highlight 2 important ways in which the women supported the IRA, providing safe houses and working as couriers. Again, the main historical narrative portrays women as remaining in the domestic sphere, providing traditional gender-based support for military men, nursing, cooking, cleaning, maintaining homes for their men. With this new multiplicity of sources and rereading older sources, we can now better understand the gendered effects of war and violence. Using women's personal archives, military pension applications, Bureau of Military History statements, memoirs, biographical texts, statements to contemporary newspapers, court proceedings, police reports, other sources, we can expand on, in a broader and more nuanced way, the experience of women, the contribution of women, and how that contribution was remembered. While first aid, signalling, and dispatch carrying was the usual work of Cumann, there is evidence that the work they carried out, even as early as 1919, contributed to the military side of the war. The women provided service in several important areas: running safe houses and caring for IRA men on the run, nursing injured volunteers, providing lines of communication for the IRA, carrying dispatches, and taking care of arms dumps. This food, shelter and care were vital to the success of the guerrilla army, and women's role in the provision of these is often dismissed, however, as within their domestic duties. However, these roles were, as Dan Breen wrote, indispensable to the army. But other indispensable roles he mentioned were carrying dispatches, scouting, and acting as intelligence agents. Their work as intelligence officer, Breen wrote, was vital to the well-being of the IRA. The involvement of Cumann in military action is something that has often been overlooked, yet without them, I would argue, the guerrilla war, as engaged by the IRA, could not have been successfully carried out. For instance, acquiring, delivering, and caring for arms and ammunition was of extreme importance to the IRA, and much of this was carried out by Cumann. Intelligence work, scouting and delivering arms and ammunition to sites of ambushes was also an important aspect of the military side of the work undertaken by Cumann. Women who lived near RIC stations and barracks where the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries were housed were a vital link in the intelligence chain for the local IRA. In their more domestic roles as nurturers and carers, and in their roles as militants, they provided a service without which the campaign conducted by the IRA could not have succeeded to the extent that it did. Their ability to move freely as women meant that their roles as scouts, intelligence gatherers, message carriers, and their expertise in securing, secreting, and transporting arms and ammunition was vital. This was acknowledged in a letter in 1921 when several IRA commandants wrote, "There was no question of the girls only helping. In dispatch carrying, scouting, and intelligence work, all of which were highly dangerous, they did far more than the soldiers. In addition to this, the flying columns would have collapsed earlier this year were it not for the assistance of women, organised and unorganised." And that means both women who were in Cumann and women who weren't in Cumann but were sympathetic to the cause. The fact that they did not go on the run, the women did not go on the run, meant then that they experienced the full brutality of reprisals carried out by Crown forces on homes and communities. Both their contributions and their suffering were, however, often ignored or overlooked in both national and regional studies. Where the women were remembered in traditional histories of the revolutionary period, it was as the loyal, courageous Cumann girls who cared for and looked after the men who fought for Ireland. And this was an important part of what they did, but it was not the only work they did for the cause at this time. The complexities of women's participation in the revolutionary period became victim to selective and gendered remembering. The traumas they suffered because of this were denied, downplayed, overlooked, or simply forgotten. Women were there to be the caring, supportive auxiliaries to the fighting men, courageous, loyal, and brave, but not militants, not combatants. Recent histories, particularly regional histories, are challenging that narrative. And regional histories are very important. And that's why it's very important for people in local areas to do research on what happened at a local level. Those micro histories then feed into the macro history to the national narrative. Historians, and it must be said mainly female historians, have been revisiting these narratives, which allowed a process of recovery of women's histories in all their complexities to be undertaken. Revisiting existing archival resources and allows expansion of the detail of what women did and why they did it. Without Cumann, the history of the War of Independence would be very different. With Cumann's history in that narrative, we then get a broader, more complicated view of the War of Independence. The complexities of women's participation in the revolutionary period had become a victim to gendered reading. We now need to challenge that. What women did was central to the narrative, and what they did deserves to be known and included in all histories of this period. Thank you very much. I hope that was something that you found interesting. And if there are any questions, I know this is not live, excuse me, but if there are any questions, certainly feel free to contact me. You can find my email on the UCD website. And if anyone has any information or stories they wish to share about the experiences of women in in their local area of Cumann women, particularly of violence against women in their local area. I'm always very interested in hearing from you and in sharing with you or you sharing with me those stories, because those micro stories add to the macro histories. So thank you again for listening, and I hope you all keep very well in this time. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Smith, and on behalf of Cavan Library Service, I would like to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in to watch our Decade of Centenaries lecture series over the past 6 weeks. The series forms part of Cavan County Council's Decade of Centenary 2020 programme, with the support of the Department of Culture, Heritage and Gaeltacht under the 2012 to 2023 initiative. I would also like to thank the speakers for providing highly informative and engaging lectures despite having to move online. I would also like to acknowledge the County Librarian, Emma Clancy, and also Sinead McCardle, who assisted with editing and marketing. In case you've missed any of our lectures, they will remain available online and can be viewed on the library website page and also on the library's Facebook page. I do hope that you've really enjoyed our lecture series. Thank you.